Hey church, welcome back to my backyard as we continue our study through 1st and 2nd Kings. Well, I guess today we're starting 2nd Kings. We have skipped a ton of material since our last gathering, and so I pray that you're keeping up with your reading because since last time, Ahab is no longer king. In fact, his son has become king and then not king because he fell and has passed away, and he didn't have any heirs. So another son of Ahab has become king in Israel, and Jehoshaphat is still king in the southern kingdom, but not king for very long. So a lot transpires, and if you are keeping up with the reading, you should be just a little bit past the reading of today, which is in 2 Kings chapter 5. So a lot transpires, and I know that 1st and 2nd Kings is kind of tough to read sometimes because it'll talk about a little bit of history, and then the next chapter seems like it goes back and kind of picks up the details. But stick with it; it's worth it. Another thing that's changed since last time is Elijah is no longer around. He has gone up to heaven in his chariot, and Elisha now is the focal prophet. And it's also kind of hard to keep those straight because their names are so similar, but their work is very similar. Elisha is now established. He's already had several miracles. The miracle of the widow and her pots filling with oil so that she can pay her debts and live. The miracle of the Shunammite woman and her son. Not only that she had a son, but the son is healed. So some really good stories in between there. In fact, a really neat story that I'm going to pick up on Sunday from 1st Kings, because there's such good material, you don't want to miss it. So anyway, today we're going to be in chapter 5 of 2nd Kings, talking about Naaman, and a very well-known story, but hopefully picking up something that maybe you've forgotten. It's always the goodness of going back and rereading a story. And your Sunday school lesson opens up with a question about what is the most common medical advice that people ignore. And this one kind of starts to step on some personal toes, because I, like most people, go to the doctor, and then the doctor tells you need to do this, need to do that, and you're like, yeah, thank you very much. A year later, you go back to see the doctor and says, well, how are you doing on this or that? And you're like, haven't done a thing. So you're ignoring that advice. Whether it's better diet or exercise or stress management, stopping a habit, whether it's drinking, smoking, keeping people away from you that are bad influence, whatever the habit is, somewhere, somehow, most of us ignore some of that advice. The question, the deeper question is, why do we ignore that advice? Because it's obviously for our betterment, but we choose to ignore it. So what are some common reasons we give for ignoring that advice? I would submit that a very common one is, I don't have time. Well, if it's for your health, someday you're going to make time, whether you like it or not. Don't have time, or another common one is probably, I just don't want to change. I like the way I am. I don't see that it's a benefit. I just don't want to. Another good one, I think, is just pride. I don't want anybody else telling me what to do. Some would call that stubbornness, but I think that's pride that stands in the way. And I think some of that is seen in our story today, in Naaman. Now, if you know the story, you know eventually that loses footing and he does change. But let's read the story and see how that plays out in some of that. So we're going to be in chapter 5. We're going to start with verses 1 through 6. And let me read that as we dig into his word. It says, Now Naaman was a commander of the army of the king of Aram. That right there tells you, again, the sovereignty of God, because he's working outside of his promised people. Aram is the same as Syria. So this is not his people. Totally. Listen further. Now Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram. He was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded, because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy. So he was a great man. He'd done great things. God had worked through him even though he was in Syria. But, big problem, he had leprosy. Leprosy was a disease that was not easily cured back then. People did not want to be around you, contagious. And so even with all of his greatness, he was pretty useless at this point in time. So it goes on to say, now bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and had taken captive a young girl from Israel. And she served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, if only my master would see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. By all means, go, the king of Aram replied. I will send a letter to the king of Israel. So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took, the king of Israel read, with this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of leprosy. Now, the young girl in this is central to the story because she is an Israelite. It would have been common back then because of where Syria and Israel are. Battles along the borders, if you will, kind of guerrilla warfare would have been taking place a long time, a lot of the time, and the raids, as it says, would have taken place across the border. People from Aram would have gone across the border, taken some stuff, and brought it back as a signal of the win of the battle, if you will. And sometimes it would have been slaves. And this is such the case with this young lady. And this particular slave was a servant to the wife of Naaman. Now this young girl had evidently been old enough to have an influence of her religious background, excuse the dog, religious background, and would have known of the prophet Elisha. Now this is good because she was old enough to have that influence. She knew what Elisha had done. Remember some of the stories I've already told you, and know that he could do something for her servant or her master. And so whether it's in passing or thinking out loud, she says something to the effect of, oh, if he only knew Elisha, meaning Naaman would only know Elisha. Well, in that, Naaman picks up on that and goes to the king, and the king writes a letter. What I want us to see in this is how one person knowing another person knowing another person. So the question comes up, what's the underlying theme in these first few verses? And I think it becomes abundantly clear. The underlying theme is the importance of relationships. First of all, the servant girl has a relationship with God. Some forms, at least strong enough to be able to say something in a foreign land about her God. Whether it was to the wife or to the master, it sounds like it's to the wife, but it was strong enough for her to say something in this foreign land. So there's a relationship with her God. Then there's the little girl's relationship to the Naaman's wife, that she would say that to the wife. Then there's the relationship of the wife to Naaman, because more than likely, from the way you read it, it sounds like the wife said something to Naaman, which there should be a good relationship between spouses anyway. But then there's the relationship between Naaman and the king. Naaman was well thought of. He was the captain of the army. He was well respected. You know, if he wasn't, and he was disposable, then the king could have just written him off and said, you're sick, go away, I'll find another person to come in. But because the relationship was so strong between the king and Naaman, he was willing to do something. So there's that relationship. And then there's the royal relationship between kings where you could send letters. So the importance of relationships is very strong in this story, all the way from a little girl all the way up to God. Had it not been for that relationship, then we would not even know the story of Naaman. So the king signs this letter and basically says, here's my endorsement. This guy is very important to me. I'm sending all this money, send him with clothes, send him with this letter of endorsement, and saying, do what you can for him. I've heard that something can be done. So there's this desperation, not only for Naaman, but for the king to have his servant back. Many times we get in a place of desperation and we need help. Who are we going to cry out to? Unless we have built those relationships, we don't know how to cry out to, much less who to cry out to. Because Naaman had a relationship with the king, had a relationship with his wife had a relationship with this little girl. It's like this network was already in place, and boom, there it went. For us today, it's kind of like our prayer network. As soon as something happens in the church, I would hope that each one of us could reach out and say, would you pray for me? And immediately the network would go out, and we would be able to ask for at least prayer, if not maybe a little bit more. Maybe there's something functional that we could do. So let's go on and see what the next step is as this letter and Naaman go into Israel and see what happens. So we're going to go to verses, well, I thought I had my notes there. Yeah, verses 7 through 10. Things were kind of blown away there for a second. 7 through 10 says this. It says, as soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me? I want to stop right there, even though your Sunday school lesson goes on, and just kind of think about what the reaction of the king is. The king totally misses, because he hasn't built a relationship, because he doesn't have the right kinds of relationship. He's totally missed the point of the letter. He doesn't have a relationship with God, that's clear. He doesn't have a relationship with Elisha, that's clear. Because if he had a relationship with either one of those, he would know what this letter is about and what to do with this letter. But instead, he tears his clothes and goes, I'm not God, I can't do anything about this. He's trying to pick a fight with me. He thinks the letter is the king of Aram trying to fight with him, trying to knock heads. And had the rest of the story not happened, he may have taken the kingdom of Israel into a national incident when that's not what it was about at all. Had he had the right network, he would have known what to do. But instead, he didn't have the right network. He wasn't connected to God. He wasn't connected to Elisha. Thankfully, word got around to the correct person, and the letter was eventually interpreted correctly. So, continue on with verses 8 through 10. It says, when Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message. So Elisha got a hold of the message somehow. We don't know exactly, but he did get the message. It says, why have you torn your robes? Meaning the king. Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a message to say to him, go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed. Elisha was the person that needed to hear the message. Somehow he got it. Elisha said, Naaman, come to me, and Naaman came to him. And he said, I've got instructions for you. Go to the Jordan, go down, wash yourself 7 times, and the result will be that your flesh, the nasty sores and all that, will fall directly off of you, and you will be healed. Why did Elisha know exactly what to do? Because he did have a relationship with God. He is a prophet, was a prophet in Israel. He had that network already in place, and he knew exactly what was going to happen. That is what happens when you're already in touch with God and you don't wait till something drastic happens. Everything's already in place. That's what we want to be. We don't want to wait for natural disaster to happen before we get ready. We want to be prepared ahead of time. How different were those reactions between the king and Elisha? Night and day difference, right? Well, in the next two sections, which I'm going to combine, your Sunday school lesson does verses 11 and 12 and then 13 and 14. I'm going to put 11 through 14 together. The reason I do that is because I want you to see, just as there were two different reactions to the request, there's going to be two different reactions to the answer of this healing. Because Elisha said, go down to the Jordan and wash yourself 7 times. Very simplistic type of treatment. But again, two different answers, or two different reactions to this answer. And that's the way it is in situations like that today. So let's go ahead and look at those two different reactions. 11 through 14 says this. It says, but Naaman went away angry and said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and went off in a rage. So stop there for just a second. That is clearly the reaction of Naaman. And he's obviously angry at this answer. He's angry apparently at for two different reasons. His first point of anger is that Elisha didn't come out. Couldn't he have at least shown his face? Now, is this because he feels that he's due the respect of showing up? Maybe. Is this because his situation is dire and he needs healing and he wants to see who's giving this advice? Again, kind of a respect issue. Maybe. He wants to make sure it's not a farce. Maybe so. I don't know. And you're thinking, well, maybe he's kind of full of himself. Well, let's be honest. This happens a lot even today. We go in to get medical treatment, and we don't think we've seen a medical professional until we've seen the doctor. We don't want to see a nurse practitioner. We don't want to see a physician's assistant. Even though they eventually have to report, in some cases, have to report to the physician, we get a little antsy too. Or if they don't spend enough time with us, we get a little antsy too. And I'm guilty of that too. But he felt like he didn't get the full force of the treatment, if you will, by not having seen him. He also gets angry by not getting the right treatment, if you will, because Elisha sent him to the Jordan, and then he says, couldn't I have gone to the river of Abana or Pharpar? These are rivers that flow faster, that are cleaner in Damascus. He said, these are much better places. Wouldn't they have cleansed me better? So that would be kind of like us, we go in to see a doctor and they order a particular test or order particular medication, and we think we should have a different type of medication, or we should have an MRI instead of an X-ray, or we think our opinions are better, and sometimes they are. Don't get me wrong, but we're second guessing the treatment that has been given to us. This is the biblical example of what we do today. And again, I'm not saying that we're wrong in doing that. I'm just giving an example of how that transpired even back then. What makes it worse in this situation is Elisha's clearly a man of God that has been given a direction to treat, if you will, Naaman. And Naaman says, this isn't right. And he just storms off and says, I'm going to do what I want to do. And he's willing to throw away the advice of what the man of God says. That's one reaction. The next reaction is in the following verses, in verse 13 and 14. It says, Naaman's servants went to him and said, My father, if the prophet had told you to do something great, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? So the second reaction is that of the servants. And they do it with great respect. They said, Father, so it's a term of endearment. There's, again, that relationship. If they hadn't had this relationship with Naaman, then there's no way that they could have had the ability to approach him. But because they had built that relationship before, they had the authorization, they had the permission to be able to say, you know what, let's take it down a notch. How about you think for just a second, had you gotten a response of do something, a grand gesture, had you not gotten the response of doing something wonderful, would you not have done that? And I guess Naaman thought for a second and said, yeah, I would have done this grand gesture, because he winds up doing it, right? But they had a good thought there. Sometimes we fail to follow through with God's plans because they're not big enough, they're not significant enough, they don't put us in the limelight enough. And all Elisha was asking Naaman to do was do a simple thing, show faith that the simple thing could work, to hang in there. I mean, that's what he's asking us to do a lot of times, right? So that argument, that simple argument, must have worked, because verse 14. So he went down, literally went down, because this distance from where they were to Jordan was probably about 25 miles, and going down would have been about, your commentary talks about being about 2,500 feet below sea level. And so he would have had to go down into the river and then do that 7 times. You know, after 3 times, maybe saw no changes. 4 times, no changes. 5, 6, no changes. He would have had enough faith, had to have had enough faith to go down a 7th time, and then that skin fell off and he was completely healed. So just that second look at the same situation by those servants, causing him to think and go, you know what? I am going to go ahead and do this. Why not at least try that? It doesn't always have to be a grand gesture. It just has to be something of faith sometimes. And that's exactly what this was. He received healing not necessarily because of the gesture, the actual Jordan. It was because of the faith that he demonstrated. Folks, that's the whole idea behind our eternal healing, is it not? It's not the walking down the aisle. It's not even the baptism. It's the faith that we're demonstrating by putting all of our hope in Jesus Christ. That's exactly what Naaman did. It wasn't the Jordan. It wasn't even walking the 25 miles. It was demonstrating the faith in all of this, that this is actually going to work. Pretty amazing story, if you ask me. And remember, he was from Aram. It wasn't even God's people. That shows us again how big God's heart is and who he can save. I hope this helps. I hope this adds to the story of Naaman. Let me pray for us. Father in heaven, I thank you so much for this time. I thank you for your word, for the truth that it is, always has been and always will be. And I pray that this brings us closer to you each and every day. And I pray this in the mighty name of Christ Jesus. Amen. Well, folks, I hope that you have had a wonderful week and that you are getting prepared for Sunday. As always, it's going to be a glorious day as we celebrate Christ in worship. Hope to see you there. God bless. Bye-bye.